Right, so Keir Starmer is in an almighty pile of bother now as Jeremy Corbyn's Gaza Independent Public Inquiry Bill has passed its first reading without division. In other words, there was no opposition to it, so it got waved through without necessitating a vote. It's a very good start, isn't it? But a long way to go still. Yet for as much work as there is for Corbyn to win over the majority of the Commons and get an inquiry going into UK complicity in Israel's genocide of Gaza, Starmer is in a far worse position because now parliamentary time must be given over to debating this at second reading, meaning Starmer's left himself wide open. Or has he? Starmer's tenure has of course been marked by dishonesty, and it is in this light that Corbyn, despite winning the day, has written to him for assurances he won't interfere, that he won't stall it, block it, bury it beneath a pile of other private members' legislation, and calling for second reading to happen on the 4th of July. That won't be missed either, US Independence Day as that is. Starmer is left with a choice, therefore. He can back Corbyn's call, an inquiry will likely take years after all. He could recognise Palestine on that day, which would be rather apt. He's apparently mulling that over with France right now, an academic measure in and of itself as that is, without action to back it up. But there's every reason for him to fear the eventual outcome here too, having gone from saying Israel has the right to cut off food and electricity on camera, as we saw him do, advocating for war crimes as he did, to now calling the situation intolerable. Repeatedly his go-to word, intolerable, to avoid calling it what it actually is, a genocide. Because if he does, he damns himself. Corbyn's got him on the ropes and he didn't even put up a fight, which he may well now come to regret, especially when you consider Corbyn's forceful speech versus Starmer's lousy ongoing excuses.
Inquiry, and I call Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for establishing an independent public inquiry into UK involvement in Israeli military operations in Gaza, to require the inquiry to consider any UK military, economic or political cooperation with Israel since October 2023, including the sale, supply or use of weapons, surveillance aircraft and Royal Air Force bases, to provide the inquiry with the power to question ministers and officials about decisions taken in relation to UK involvement and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the aftermath of the Iraq War, several attempts were made to establish an inquiry surrounding the conduct of British military operations. The government of the day spent many years resisting those attempts and those demands for an inquiry. However, they could not prevent the inevitable, and in 2016 we had the publication of the Chilcot Inquiry, which Sir John Chilcot had undertaken over several years. The report found serious failings within the British government, which ignored the warnings of millions of ordinary people who had been protesting on the streets against the invasion. I was leader of the Labour Party at that time when the report came out, and I apologised on behalf of the Labour Party for the catastrophic decision to go to war in Iraq. History is now repeating itself. Over the past 18 months, human beings have endured a level of horror and inhumanity that should haunt us all forever. Entire families wiped out, limbs strewn across the street, mothers screaming for their children buried under the rubble, human beings being torn to pieces, doctors performing amputations without anaesthetic, children picking grass and dirt from the ground thinking they might find something edible to eat. The survivors will face lifelong mental health consequences which will go on for generations. Home by home, hospital by hospital, generation by generation. We are not just witnessing a war, we are witnessing a genocide, this time live-streamed all over the world. Today, the death toll in Gaza exceeds 61,000. And at least 110,000 people, or 1 in 20 of the entire population, have been severely injured. 2 Israeli officials are now wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain has played a highly influential role in Israel's military operations. First, Britain has been supplying weapons to Israel, weapons that are being used to bomb the people of Palestine. This, of course, started with the previous Conservative government, but is continued with the current Labour government. In fact, between October and December 2024 alone, more arms export licences were granted than were approved by the previous government for the whole of 2020 and 2023. In September 23, the government suspended some licences but continued to allow the supply of F-35 components to the global pool. The Foreign Secretary has accepted the fact that F-35 jets are being used in violation of international humanitarian law, yet at the same time admits those parts go into the global supply chain and could therefore go to Israel. They know full well the implications. By justifying the continued licensing of these parts, our government is admitting its complicity in what are quite clearly war crimes. I find this truly astounding. The government is telling us loud and clear that its participation in this programme is more important than upholding international law and the Convention on Genocide. It's very simple. Until this government ends the sale of weapons to Israel, it will remain complicit in the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza at the present time. Secondly, many of us have repeatedly been asking for the truth regarding the role of British military bases in Cyprus. Since October 23, military cargo has been airlifted from RAF Akrotiri to Israel. This cargo has often travelled to Cyprus from US military bases in other parts of Europe. Meanwhile, RAF shadow aircraft have also been conducting nightly surveillance flights over Gaza. And when the Prime Minister visited RAF Akrotiri last December, he was telling troops the whole world and everyone back at home is relying on you. Quite a bit of what goes on here can't necessarily be talked about all of the time. We can't necessarily tell the world what you're doing. In a recent report by the British Palestine Committee, it says the UK government is engaged in military actions without being subject to parliamentary scrutiny, and that these actions implicate its institutions and officials in the gravest breaches of international law. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, over the past 18 months, our questions have been met with evasion, obstruction and silence, leaving the public in the dark over the way in which the responsibilities of government have been discharged. Transparency and accountability are the cornerstones of democracy. The public deserves to know the scale of the UK complicity in these atrocities. Any meaningful inquiry would require the cooperation of the government, both governments, the Conservative and Labour Party governments, involved in decision-making processes since October 23. The inquiry needs to ask what arms have been supplied to Israel, which of these weapons have been used in Gaza and the West Bank. Is the government's position that it cannot or will not bring the F-35 programme in line with UK's legal obligations? What is RAF Akrotiri being used for? Is it being used as a route for weapons that are being deployed in Gaza? How many US Air Force flights have flown from RAF Akrotiri to Israel since October 23? Have Israel F-35 jets been stored and repaired at RAF bases in Akrotiri or anywhere else? What video footage does the government have of the war zone from RAF flights? Will it release this footage? What intelligence has been passed on to Israel? What legal advice has the government received over an assessment of genocide, and when will it publish this advice? Mr. Speaker, I want to finish by reminding the House that in October 23, many of us called for an immediate ceasefire, for the bombing to stop, and for the release of all hostages. We condemned those attacks, but expressed alarm over the wholly disproportionate nature of the response. We warned that we were witnessing the beginning of the total annihilation of Gaza, and we pleaded with political leaders on both sides to call for peace. Today, some politicians have finally begun to backtrack a bit. Perhaps they're frightened of the consequences and of their own inhumanity. If there was any integrity in this, All those that support the operation of the military there would weep for the 61,000 Palestinian lives that have been lost, buried under the rubble, and the moral cowardice of politicians in this country and others that have allowed this to go on. Today, we teach children about history's worst war crimes against humanity. They're asked to reflect about how those crimes ever came about. Our future history books will report with shame those that had the opportunity to stop this carnage but failed to act to achieve it. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue our campaigns in this House and outside because we're appalled at what is happening. Our demonstrations, the huge demonstrations in this country and all around the world, are made up of people of all ages, all faiths, and actually quite a wide range of political opinion. They're united with the simple human request that we stop the bombing and save lives, and we stop that bombing by no longer supplying any weapons to do it. We will continue to campaign for truth, for accountability, and most importantly, for peace and for justice for the Palestinian people who've been denied all of that for far too long. Today, if this bill is agreed, and I hope it will be, this will be a step forward in opening up the murky history of what's gone on, the murky arms sales, and the complicity in appalling acts of genocide.
Which is people are looking, of course, at the pictures of children in Gaza. The government's position has barely changed. What would it take for you to name it as genocide?
Well, in relation to what's happening in Gaza, we've been absolutely clear that it is intolerable. And we need to get back to a ceasefire urgently, and that is our constant work with other allies to get us to that position. We need those hostages to come out. Many of them have been held for a very long time. And of course, humanitarian aid needs to get in at speed and at volume. But that can only happen if we get back to a ceasefire. So absolutely clear that the situation as it is utterly intolerable. And that's why we've taken measures like the trading talks have been stood down, the sanctions we've been put in, but we're working with allies to see what else we can do.
Right, so that was the 10-minute speech by Jeremy Corbyn there. He stepped into the House of Commons and delivered a searing and principled 10-minute speech. I hope you thought so too. It's why I played the whole thing, a description I hope you would agree with, that cut through all of the Starmeroid political doublespeak that is incessantly covering for the UK's role in Israel's genocide of Gaza. Corbyn's introduction of his Gaza Independent Public Inquiry Bill marks a critical juncture for British politics, one that has already forced an overdue national reckoning on the moral and legal implications of the UK government's complicity, both Starmer's and the Tories before him, in what credible politicians only have the spine to actually call a genocide. Corbyn's speech was a powerful condemnation of both Israeli conduct since October 7, 2023, and the British government's ongoing support for it. Corbyn accused Israel of unleashing a disproportionate, sustained military assault on Gaza in response to the Hamas incursion, reducing the besieged strip to absolute desolation. In unflinching language, Corbyn demanded a full and independent investigation into the UK's role in this carnage. Arms sales, surveillance assistance, the diplomatic shielding of Israel from accountability. And what made Corbyn's bill even more compelling was its parliamentary success. Passed at its first reading with a simple aye, no vote at all needed, it now compels a full debate. The second reading is scheduled, perhaps not coincidentally, for the 4th of July, which is Independence Day in the US. So the symbolism should be obvious. A call for British accountability and sovereignty in foreign policy free from alignment with the United States and Israel's war aims to be continued on the day the US celebrates breaking free from the UK. Let's have a debate on Gazan misery being enabled by UK support for Israel ending on that day too. And yet, while Corbyn stands on the side of justice, Keir Starmer, as that bit of footage showed, remains entangled in political cowardice and moral equivocation, all of his own making, licking his lips and gulping as the matter of genocide is put to him yet again, and yet again he refuses to say the word. His refusal to call Israel's actions a genocide and instead hiding behind the word intolerable reveals more than hesitance. It exposes a deliberate strategy to avoid the legal and political consequences for his unflinching support of Israel, that as a former human rights lawyer he knows he's damned by. In doing so, Starmer continues to align the Labour Party and as a result this country with state-sanctioned violence and ignored both the public's conscience and international law. The UK government has consistently enabled Israel's war on Gaza through arms sales and military cooperation. British-made components are present in Israel's F-35 fighter jets, and after a suspension of arms licenses in September of last year, the Starmer government carried on approving more of them. More weapons sales in the following 4 months than the Tories had in their last 4 years of government. The UK has never been more complicit than it is under Starmer. RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, as Corbyn mentioned, a British airbase, continues to be used for surveillance flights aiding Israeli military operations. It's never stopped. That is not passive complicity, it is active participation, and that is why Starmer won't call it a genocide, because he'd be admitting his complicity if he did. Also, despite mounting evidence of those war crimes and the genocidal conduct by the Israeli military, Starmer has refused to confront the legal consequences to these ties. To label Israel's actions as genocide, as he well understands, would not only cause international legal eyes across his governance, but it would also obligate the UK under the Genocide Convention to act. And as a Zionist, without equivocation, his words, it's the last thing he ever wants to do, even if it is the right thing to do. Instead, he clings to platitudes about intolerable suffering, a word so vague and so sanitised that it effectively serves to dull public outrage to match Starmer's own inherent dullness. Jeremy Corbyn's bill, by contrast, aligns with the will of the British people. A recent poll by Opinion revealed that a majority of Britons want a full arms embargo on Israel and support its expulsion from the United Nations. The poll was conducted on behalf of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and it found that 57% of people want a full UK arms embargo on Israel, with only 13% opposed. 53% of people think Israel should be expelled from the United Nations. Half of respondents said Israeli products and supermarkets should be boycotted. And 54% backed the imposition of sanctions on Israel's self-described fascist finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, a supporter of Israel's starvation blockade of Gaza, who agreed to stay in the Netanyahu cabinet in return for extensive attacks on the occupied West Bank. Another survey showed Labour's support plummeting, giving Starmer an even bigger but entirely self-inflicted headache. A YouGov Eurotrack poll of public approval or disapproval found that only 12% of respondents approve of the Labour government's policies and performance, while a massive 67%, more than 2/3 of voters, disapprove. Less than a year into power, driven at least in part by Starmer's unpopularity, for a whole raft of policy reasons after all, but at least in part for Starmer's unwavering support for Israel. And yet, when Corbyn stood in Parliament to deliver a speech on this issue of life and death for so many Palestinian people, most Labour MPs didn't even bother to show up. The Commons was sparsely attended. There was no vote. Most abstained in effect, therefore, not out of neutrality, but fear of crossing the party line. The silence in the chamber was deafening. It showed that despite the massive red line protest that was happening outside, where thousands of demonstrators demanded an end to UK complicity, inside Parliament, most Labour MPs clearly had no red line. 10 Labour MPs did formally back Corbyn's bill, exposing the widening rift within the party, these being Diane Abbott, Brian Leishman, Richard Bergen, Steve Witherden, Kim Johnson, Nadia Whittome, Ian Byrne, Bell Ribeiro-Addy, John Trickett and Neil Duncan-Jordan. In total, 40 MPs from across the political spectrum co-sponsored the legislation, from the Green Party, the Independent Alliance, the SNP, Plaid Cymru and a few more. Though despite all the pro-Palestine sentiment currently coming from some Tories, none of them did. Can't imagine why. Not weaponising the issue for personal gain here, surely. Who could possibly think such a thing? Anyway, cross-party support has turned what might have been dismissed as a lone act of defiance into a much more significant parliamentary challenge here, and a greater show of public representation. Corbyn has vowed to write to Starmer demanding the government not block the second reading now, reminding him that this issue will not be buried, and evidently not putting it past him to try either. Corbyn's bill rightly forces Parliament and the public to confront what has been unfolding in Gaza since October 7th. More than 54,000 Palestinians have been killed, the majority of them women and children. Entire neighbourhoods have been erased, hospitals have been bombed, famine is spreading. This is not just an intolerable situation. It is a systematic, deliberate destruction of a people. It is genocide. Legal scholars, international human rights organisations and United Nations officials have all warned of the genocidal character of Israel's campaign in Gaza. The International Court of Justice, in response to South Africa's genocide case against Israel, has issued provisional measures indicating that genocide is plausibly occurring. Still, Starmer and the British government resist the use of that word, that specific word, that meaningful word. They know better, it seems. But knowing full well what it would demand of them, which is much more the issue in my mind, that they will not use it. The Gaza inquiry bill is not unprecedented. It follows in the historical shadow of the Chilcot inquiry, of course, into the Iraq war, something Corbyn cited in his speech there, which found systemic failings in the UK government's decision-making processes, particularly in its blind alignment with the United States at that. And despite Chilcot, an empty cell still remains in The Hague because Tony Blair, of course, remains a free man, and worse, still exerting influence in British politics when his all-too-common rare interventions are as unwelcome as ever. That legacy haunts today's crisis. Starmer appears determined to repeat it, perhaps because Blair got away with what he did. But, and this is not in any way intended to play down what happened, where Iraq has had a chance to rebuild and recover, the situation in Gaza is worse because Israel will only stop with Gaza's erasure. Just as with Iraq, the UK risks being remembered for being on the wrong side of history, but Corbyn's bill offers a path forward not of vengeance but of truth, accountability and justice. A genuine inquiry into UK complicity could expose not just the arms deals and military cooperation, but the rot at the heart of British foreign policy. Too much is being dictated by the US with everything that comes with that. The introduction of the Gaza inquiry bill needs to be a watershed moment for this country. It signals that even in the face of overwhelming state power and media silence, there are still those in British politics willing to speak truth to power, and we must get behind them and Parliament to deliver the will of the people on this. Corbyn's speech was measured, it was factual, it was resolutely moral. It was a kind of leadership that is rare in Westminster and serves once again as a reminder of what could have been, if not for the establishment attack on the man who would have brought real change to the UK and not pretend they stood for change whilst continuing US foreign policy and Tory austerity, as Keir Starmer has done. The Red Line protest outside Parliament in support of Corbyn was a start, but now citizens must sustain pressure on MPs, on political parties and on the mainstream media. Demand that the government support Corbyn's bill. Demand that Parliament name a genocide when it sees it. Demand that arms sales to Israel, all of them, bar none, end now. If this bill is debated and ultimately passed, it can be the first real step towards accountability. If it gets blocked or it gets ignored, it will be a damning indictment of the moral failure of Britain's political class, and that will be all on Starmer. Keir Starmer has a choice. He can finally stand with international law, with what is right and just, with the victims of a genocidal war and with the conscience of the British people. Or he can continue to equivocate and shield the Israeli government from consequences, keep on calling it intolerable, whilst ensuring his legacy will be one of complicity and cowardice. The question now is not whether the suffering in Gaza is intolerable. It is whether our tolerance for hypocrisy and evasion and injustice in British politics has finally run out, and what are we going to do about it then? Of course, the chances of Starmer listening are slim, because another key part of his government's unpopularity right now, and again, making the prospect of changing his ways with regards to Israel equally so, is his sudden increase in defence spending, going down like a lead balloon as he maintains we need to be war ready. When his life becomes harder and harder, more and more of us are questioning what exactly would we be fighting for to defend. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.